Watercolour begins and ends with the excitement of watching pigments in water. It has the qualities of ancient alchemy in that what the painter is doing is going to convert base material, that beautiful base material, into something which didn't exist before, hopefully something of great beauty. And the process of watercolour, learning how to use paint, is something which has been passed from artist to artist, generation to generation. It's not about mastery, it's about studentship, endless studentship to the processes that occur. So the first demonstration was obviously what happens when you put watercolour into water. You'd think that when you put red into a jar of water, the water would immediately turn into pink or something, or become all red, but it doesn't. The red kept its beautiful shape. Then when you add yellow, might expect to see orange, but you don't. What you get is the red dancing and the yellow dancing next to it, both moving beautifully, making shapes which in themselves, out of the quality of the medium itself, are beautiful to look at. The shapes we see in clouds, and we see them everywhere in nature. And then when you add blue, you'd expect to get green because you've got yellow, or purple because you've got red. But instead, it dances independently. The three beautiful colours swirling and moving naturally together. And excited, as a human being wanting to paint and use the paint, I think this is terrific. And I put my brush in to help it, and I end up with mud, a dark brown absence of colour. So the challenge for the watercolourist, the challenge of the alchemy of watercolour, is to take these materials and then create things with the material that still retain some of the qualities. You can work very monochromatically, you can work brighter, you can work light, you can work dark, you can do all sorts of things once you learn the basic techniques. And in this very short video, I want to demonstrate in a simple painting some of the basic techniques of watercolour and tell you what they are as we look at them. So let's have a look together at a simple demonstration of a landscape painted in watercolour, which makes use of those processes that I've just demonstrated. The most important thing of all to remember is that watercolour starts wet and dries. It might sound obvious, but it's very important when you're painting. And what we're actually looking at is the settling of coloured sediment, which is the coloured pigment, in water. It settles to the bottom, as we saw in the jar. Then when the water evaporates and is gone, and then it finally dries, it stays where you left it. If you wetted it again, it can be removed. This is really important, as you'll see in a moment. Now, the demonstration we're going to watch together is of a small landscape, not unlike this one, which is a sort of a classic lakeland scene. It could be Tasmania, it could be almost anywhere. And it's comprised of three elements: the sky, foreground, and in the middle, landforms. Now, I'm using a number of different techniques here and principles. The first is what we call a wet-in-wet sky, which is pigment put into a wet surface that stays soft and diffused, almost as if it's the pigment floating around in the jar. Then the same thing for the foreground of diffused warm colour. These were cool. This is cool broadly, and this is warm down here, talking to each other, but they're the same sort of process. This starts off as wet into wet. But the mountain, you'll notice here, has a crisp edge, and that must have been painted when the surface was dry, so you can look for that. I'm introducing colours all the way through, but working with that basic requirement that I have to go from wet to dry. I can add water again, I can remove colour, I can do all sorts of things, but broadly speaking, I can't change the simple process of wet to dry. So it's a simple landscape: sky, mountain, foreground, using the processes of wet, semi-wet, and finally crisp details when it's dry. So let's have a watch of this little demonstration I did before. Remember, to me, it's only a demonstration, but it shows lots of the techniques. And it's actually the sort of landscape I would recommend to anyone who wanted to learn to paint, to practice these and look at the landscapes that have been painted by the great masters, and that's where you find your technique. And that was the basis of my own study from Turner. So let's have a look at it together. First process in this wet painting technique is to obviously wet the sheet. First thing I did, spray a little bit of water and then disperse it with a broad, soft brush. I could have picked, in the days before sprayers, obviously I'd have picked the water up with the brush. Now I want that to be even over the whole sheet, and it's very important that there's not too much of it. Then I can start adding the dark colour, which is a grey made up of a red and a blue actually, to create the cloud effect. Now these are the dark shadowy part of the clouds. That is the grey of the cloud itself and the shadows under the cloud, these darker elements. I've reserved or left unpainted a white area into which I'm going to bring blue in a moment to define the white of the clouds. You'll see how this works now. And this is a very important technique in traditional watercolour used by lots of people, but most famously by John Constable in the 1800s. So I brought the blue in around the grey shapes, leaving white areas which will be the fluffy white parts of the cloud. If they were a cumulus cloud, then it might be crisp at the very top. Now comes the foreground that I mentioned. This is a warm colour. I'm using probably yellow ochre and raw umber to charge that foreground area. Charging means really to attack the paint, to attack one area with another area by dropping wet colour into wet colour. So that gives me the overall composition established. Now I can start to add the mountain, which is also added with wet into wet. And it's built up of two colours, the grey plus the same blue that I used for the sky, because they're talking to each other, the way I see it. Still the picture is wet into wet. Now cerulean blue, which is an enlivening colour. Still all I've done is charge, and I'm charging some colour into the foreground, including a bit of cerulean blue, where I'm going to have a lake, which at the moment just looks like a blue splodge, but I know the process I'm going to use to bring light back to it in a few minutes. To clean my brush, now comes cheating. The Moravian century painter had a hairdryer to dry, but I'm not doing anything very different from the sort of thing they would have done, which might be to hold a painting up to the fire or hang it to dry as Turnitin over a fire. So I've brought it a bit drier, and you can see when I add paint in here, it's not dispersing quite as much because the paper is not quite as wet as it was. It's still not dry, or I'd have sharp edges. We've skipped to a point where the paper was dry, and I can now add the crisp upper edges of the mountain. This technique is called gradated wash. I've added the crisp areas, and then I put clean water in so that it blends off and fades into the mountain, the broad mountain below. Now I've got a dark area of mountain against a lighter area of grey. I'm bringing some blue in to enliven it, but now I'm going to use another process called lifting out. I paint the mountain with clear water, and by wiping it with a tissue, I'll end up with a light area of mountain, maybe it's snow, against the grey of the cloud. And that gives me what's called a counter change, dark against light, light against dark. The casual observer will only notice, hopefully, that it looks like a mountain with the light playing across it. But I have to know what the process is. All right, all of this is basically just building the picture, and for a painter who's been painting for a while, this is a fairly impulsive, sort of unconscious process that you have to do as you sort of bring that mountain to life. Dry this area again, and now I'm deciding where to put the surface of the lake, and here it goes. This is the second bit of cheating that no painter of an earlier era would have had access to. I'm using a removable tape to create an exposed area of paper, of dry paper, where I can lift out the surface of the lake. In the old days, I would have just put a ruler down and wiped a wet brush along the base below the ruler and lifted that out. But this gives me today I can do it even more accurately with this. Process is the same, technique, and the equipment is a little bit different. So now I'm wetting the dry paint, but the only area that gets wet is the little gap between the two pieces of tape, and wiping it with a tissue, and that enables me to lift out a white line. Now by blending clean water down to the bottom, I can show the light reflected from the clouds into the lake below. This is where you're sort of really, as a teacher of mine used to say, this is where you're orchestrating the composition. You've got the tune, you've got the instruments, but you're bringing one thing up and lowering another thing down, another part down. Make this a little louder, that a little quieter, and so on. Most painters, I imagine, have to feel a sense of connection. For me, if I can't paint the picture in one go without coming back to it, I probably can't paint it. In my case, that's very important. So this whole picture, when we filmed it, took about 20 minutes, and we've shortened it down to 7, 8, 9 minutes. Now I'm using a dry brush, which means a wet brush, but onto dry paper, so that the marks made are quite crisp to create the effect of grass here and there. Now at this point, I could touch almost any part of that painting and there's no damage to it because it's completely dry, just as I mentioned, like a clay pan before. This is a little bit of orchestration. Lots of tissue gets thrown around because it's really important to use clean tissue. Traditionally, people would have used rags in the past. Now finally, to bring in the character that brings everything to life. If this was a stage set, the first thing I'd do is light the stage. I would hopefully create lots of light and dark drama. I'd put in the props, bring in the supporting cast, set the whole thing up as a platform for the lead performer. And in this case, it'll be a bird that gives purpose to the whole thing. The bird representing the fleeting moment that never comes back. The picture itself is of something which is fairly eternal, mountains and mist, mountain appearing and disappearing, concealing the sky. They do this process forever. But the bird lives for a very short time and never comes back. So it brings life and the moment to the picture. These sorts of elements are, of course, in the back of your mind when you're painting. So 2 little crisp strokes onto dry paper create an eagle or some bird hovering over the landscape and relating to the peak. And it's amazing, certainly to me, that the sort of thing, the sort of element that something like that brings to a picture like this. Now for me, this isn't really a painting. This is a demonstration. I'm happy that it might look attractive enough, but it's a demonstration to show you all these processes. If you were looking at this and didn't see the processes explained, it might seem remarkable that you could paint something so quickly in such a short period of time. But really, it's not all that special. Now, this is using a traditional approach to bring even more light back to the top edge of that lace. So I've taken a razor blade, put a ruler down, and scraped along the edge. Any blade would have done it. J.M.W. Turner, when he wanted to remove things, actually kept a thumbnail sharpened like an eagle's claw, which he used to scrape back. Well, thank you for joining me on the QV Mag YouTube channel. I hope you enjoyed that little demonstration of traditional watercolour method. The reason I showed you that was not to show how cleverly I could paint a picture. That's not a particularly clever picture, and as you saw, really anyone can do it once they learn how to use the technique. But I think it's exciting that watercolour is such a stimulating medium and allows us so much opportunity for creating. But remember, that creation is utterly dependent upon the splendid alchemy that occurs when you mix pigment with water, allow it the time to settle, allow it the time to dry, and let it form into something which, protected, will look the same in 1,000 years' time. Which I think is tremendously exciting, that you've managed to bring together all of these elements of nature, the sediment and the water and the time and space, and using gravity and so on to create something that didn't exist before. The other thing about this is that it shows you the creative possibilities that anyone interested in painting might find within themselves and what they're creating, just by getting interested in the medium and pursuing it. And that, of course, is where all artists come from, is excitement about using some sort of magic medium and going where it leads you. The very opposite, as I said at the beginning, it's not about mastery. It's the very opposite from walking your dog along on a lead and holding it tight, is to allow it to run free and to go where it chooses to take you. I think painting with watercolour is very much like a walk with somebody or something that wants to go walking with you. And if you work cooperatively with it, who knows where it could lead. Now the next two videos, and I hope you'll join me for those, the first one is on the certainly my own study of J.M.W. Turner, but not towards showing you what I've learned again, but hopefully towards what you or anyone else can learn from studying the work of a great master. And in terms of watercolour, there's probably no one who you could rank greater than J.M.W. Turner, the famous 19th century British master painter in watercolour and oils. And then after that, the final video is one which shows what I'm now doing with acrylic that steps off entirely from working in watercolour, but is entirely dependent upon what I've learned from watercolour. And I hope you'll enjoy that as well. So please join me again on the QV Mag YouTube channel for those other two videos. Thank you.